Hello and welcome to Lands Unknown. My name is Will, and today I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on kingdoms and empires based on some of the recommendations that I've got on YouTube and Reddit and those sorts of things. This is another Marginalia, so note to the margins. It is a pre-recorded live that is going to be minimally edited. And in the background here, we're going to have a recording of the painting that I did for the gracile yales for the next chapter, the next part of the biogeography chapter of the Speculative Atlas, chapter 2b. And so for these thoughts on constructed kingdoms, I'm going to cover about 5 different things that I tend to see. They're all really interconnected, so I'll probably jump between them a bit. But the first one is that kingdoms are the default polity, and it's usually the case in more fantasy-inspired world building that is set in worlds that are also equivalent or based on different pasts or histories of Earth. So, if you set it in the middle millennium, like the medieval period, Bronze Age period, those sorts of things, then the kingdom starts to become kind of a default polity. Oftentimes kingdoms are imagined as a specific type of polity, and I'll get into how diverse kingdoms were in a little bit. And a part of that too is that kingdoms are also imagined as overly personalist. So these kingdoms are not, they don't really have institutions as such. They're usually governed solely through relationships between elites. That's what I mean by it's overly personalist. They don't have institutions and organizations that help them govern. They don't engage in specific, political processes. It's simply based on the relationships between elites, and then, the elites themselves tasking certain people to then carry things out, rather than, having things like councils and engaging in assemblies and those sorts of things. The next one is that kingdoms seem to be imagined by world builders as teleological, so something that is inevitable. It's also very much a stagist idea. And then kingdoms as synchronic. So this idea that kingdoms are limited or should be placed in a specific time and place. So it's, periodizing the kingdom in a specific past. And that kind of lends it to being the default polity as well. So it's like, if you have a polity in a, faux feudal kind of pseudo medieval world, it should be a kingdom. And, kingdoms look like this. So as kingdoms being the default polity, it seems the thing that people pick for fantasy worlds, and it more so seems to be an aesthetic choice than being inspired by the politics or the governance of a kingdom. And just to break down very quickly what a kingdom is just a polity ruled by a king or a queen. It's just a monarchic polity. It doesn't imply anything about the polity itself. It doesn't talk about how stratified it is. It doesn't talk about how power is concentrated or, how the normative order is negotiated. It doesn't talk about how territoriality is spatialized. It doesn't talk about the relationship between the monarchs and their subjects or the aristocracy. And it also kind of projects this understanding upon the middle millennium, but the medieval world in the European subcontinent in particular, where it was just full of kingdoms where, you had, I guess, a kingdom, and then it was filled, the kingdom was made up of, I guess, dukedoms and which is another word for a duchy again. A dukedom is a polity, a ducal polity, one ruled by a duke or a duchess. Where what we actually tend to see, particularly in the fragmented landscape of the European subcontinent, is that kingdoms exist in this really diverse landscape and include a wide variety of polities. You had urban and rural communes. You also had just independent urban republics and citizen states, or often called like city states. You had a variety of religious polities like bishoprics, as well as abbeys and nunneries, where the head nun or abbot who would actually be the one who's interfacing with the king or the king's governance structures. You also, of course, had these kind of subordinate polities like dukedoms and baronies and those sorts of things. You also had principalities, which could be very much independent polities as well, though in the mind of medieval writers on politics, kings had a certain degree of sovereignty that principalities and other, subordinate polities in their imagination, didn't have the same kind of sovereignty. And a kingdom was both, yes, a place with a king, though, if you wanted to be, for example, king of the French, king of the Franks, it usually implied that you had a certain amount of territory, or your current territory encompassed sort of these past ideas of territories that have been handed down. So, there was this sort of geographic imagination as to what kingdoms should look like, in addition to there was this idea of what a kingdom should look like. There were also inherited ideas of who a king should be and what a king should be like, the notion of the rex and those kinds of things passed down from the Romans. And monarchs themselves, they're in this landscape where there are a bunch of different kinds of polities, but monarchs often ruled over not just other nobles, but they could directly rule over a commune, like a rural commune that kind of governed itself. In the Holy Roman Empire, for example, there were many rural and some urban and urban communes that were self-governing and only had, so there was, and only had to interface with the emperor themselves. So rather than in other polities that were part of the Holy Roman Empire, where you could have, it could be a bishopric, and you had to interact with you had commoners, and then you had the bishop, and then you had the emperor, for example. These communes would just have the people and their elected or delegated representatives, and then the emperor. So this was, quite different. Monarchs could also rule over independent cities, these urban communes that were created. Oftentimes urban communes were created to separate them from, aristocratic magnates around them. And of course, monarchs would also be ruling over these religious jurisdictions like abbeys and nunneries and these kinds of things. They were also interfacing with multiple different kinds of jurisdictions. So monarchs, they would very much have sovereignty over their own titled land, especially during the early and middle parts of the medieval period. This started to change a bit in the late period, especially as you get into the early modern period. But, they had jurisdiction over their own lands because in many ways, monarchs were just one noble among many, who could have similar ranks. I mean, in many kingdoms, the king was not the wealthiest noble. There were often dukes and things who rivaled or surpassed the king in wealth. And this was, also part of the fragmentation that was very much a part of many polities in the middle millennium and those before it, was that, the king could not necessarily exert themselves throughout all of their territory equally, because you had these other magnates, these other aristocrats who had just as not, if not more power than they did. And if the king decided to step out of line and try to exert themselves, then these dukes could mobilize other aristocrats and try to overthrow them in a coup, or, place one of the king's relatives on the throne instead. So there was a lot of diversity in the landscape, both, between autonomous polities, but also within polities themselves. And, just to kind of finish that other thought, where you have you have a king and then you have a bunch of dukes and barons and those sorts of things. Those dukes and barons, the duke may have vassal relationships of their own, but on the duke's land, the duke has their own jurisdiction and their own sovereignty. And then on their own fief's land, they have their own jurisdictions and sovereignties. They're the vassals, that they have. And this creates quite a complex landscape where it really requires the negotiation between a variety of different sovereignties in order to make things happen. And, with states today, like a nation state, we imagine warfare is happening between states. If a state is weak, if it's fragmented, then there may be a civil conflict. But in a functioning state, you wouldn't really imagine component parts kind of going to war with one another and that just being a fine and normal thing that could happen. These kind of private wars that could occur that were quite common, particularly in the European subcontinent during the medieval period. And while there were, these, Republican citizen states, which were oftentimes like pretty oligarchic. So you could have these more Republican citizen states. You could have, rural communes that were autonomous, peasants' republics and those kinds of things. They were constantly harassed by aristocrats who would try to conquer them and incorporate those lands into their own holdings. And this is largely because these aristocrats would, see these lands as not having a kind of sovereign jurisdiction. They're not belonging to another aristocrat. So, they were kind of up for grabs for whoever could take them. And you see in several of these republics, especially, in the Swiss republics, like Geneva, for example. Geneva was constantly being preyed upon by aristocratic polities around them. I mean, France often spent a lot of time influencing their politics in supporting different oligarchic factions in order to control the city-state. And a lot of the conflict within these city-states was between, those oligarchic factions who wanted to continue to stratify society and centralize power, and those which were trying to enfranchise more people and level inequalities between them. So when we think about the feudal period, I mean, there's a lot, or not the feudal period, if we think about the medieval period, there are a lot of different polity types that one could look towards when thinking about what's available in the landscape. And also, you can create very interesting dynamics where you have if you even wanted to have a fantasy kingdom, okay, well, the king has to deal with nobles as per the norm. Then they also have to deal with a nunnery. Maybe a nunnery is very powerful and they, collect their very important economic action. They're very important economically for producing things. Maybe there are a bunch of rural communes and aristocrats want to conquer them, but these rural communes provide taxes directly to the monarch. So, maybe more worthwhile if they stayed autonomous, and like all these different kinds of things. But then we can also get into the fact that like kingdoms are not a specific kind of polity. I think, and this kind of gets into this sort of overly personalist notion in fantasy kingdoms, and I often see this presented from a more writerly example where they say, oh, kingdoms are just easier to write because there are fewer people you have to keep track of. They imagine the story and the politics of the story as being held by a small number of people. And while that's definitely true, power is concentrated in a smaller number of people. I mean, the society may still be fragmented because those people with power are not centralized into kind of one structure. They have their own power bases that they can exert. But there were still institutions in politics that were being engaged in, right? Like there are, different nobles have their own factions and they want different things. It's not this sort of straightforward story. And there's also a lot of monarchies that had parliaments. They would organize, what are known as the different estates. So they would bring together magnates who are aristocrats, as well as those who belonged to the church when we're talking about Christian Europe. And they would also bring together the third estate. And the third estate was the commoners. And these would be representatives from urban as well as rural communes who would also participate in these councils. And usually kings would have these councils because they wanted to raise money to go do things like have conquests or, build monumental architecture or repay debts from doing military campaigns and things. So in exchange for that, they would hold these parliaments, they would have these councils, and the people would come and they would agree to them. And at times, these could be seen as just kind of rubber stamping. Though we have many examples from across Europe. I mean, there's some from the Cortes, which was the parliaments that we'd have in the Iberian Peninsula, where, rural and urban communes would delegate members to go represent their interests at these councils, at these parliaments. And if they did not vote in the way that they had agreed to in advance, because again, these are delegates, like these are not electors who, people elect and then let them go off and do whatever they'd like. No, these are delegates. The agendas would have been decided in advance. The urban and rural communes would have discussed these agendas, come to conclusions, and then sent their delegate out. If their delegate voted in a way they did not want them to, they would tar and feather them, put them in the stocks, have other punishments for them. Though, one could imagine being a commoner in a parliament surrounded by a king and nobles and things. That could certainly be a pretty intimidating environment. On the other hand, going home and facing the ridicule and enmity from your neighbors and everyone who lives around you and your family could be much more of a daunting prospect. So there were these institutions that monarchs had to engage with. And of course, there are pretty famous episodes of monarchs not wanting to engage in these things. And this is kind of where the split comes from with more constitutional monarchies as opposed to absolute monarchies. Many of the monarchies in the middle millennium in the European subcontinent had to deal with just having fractured power. All of their magnates, the other aristocrats, religious polities, cities themselves were pretty self-sufficient and quite economically powerful, especially compared to some of the properties and lands that the kings, the monarchs had themselves. So, you see this split in the late medieval and early modern period where the polities, and not these were not peaceful decisions. Oftentimes they include civil war and rebellions. Either went towards more constitutional monarchies, more parliamentary monarchies, where power and decision-making was negotiated between different legislatures and the monarch on the one hand, and then absolute monarchies. And these absolute monarchies are more centralizations of power into the hands of the monarch. And not all of these went well. We have things like the French Revolution and whatnot that kind of came out of some of these attempts of centralization. And these emerged not just from the commons who, didn't like the increase in taxes and the difficulties that all these things created, but also came from the magnates, came from the aristocrats who, could see their power and their influence and their property diminish under these campaigns for centralization, as well as their importance. Many of these campaigns of centralization removed them from their traditional centers of power. For example, for many aristocrats, they're military or warrior aristocrats. Their positions were in the military and the army, and they were the ones responsible for essentially mobilizing and fighting. That was a large part of their identity and where their power came from. Many of these centralization attempts took the military power and put it in the hands of the monarch, and the monarch became the one who was responsible for the army, which then the aristocrats could participate in as officers or as, elite infantry or cavalry or these kinds of things. But it took the role of leading and organizing the military away from the aristocrats themselves. So, we can have these, more parliamentary or constitutional or absolutist monarchies. But then within this, we also have a bunch of different ways for monarchs to be chosen. Oftentimes, I've seen this kind of distinguished as between like successive monarchies and electoral monarchies. I mean, all of these monarchies, electoral monarchies are just another kind of succession. I mean, what kind of distinguishes monarchies is that there is the kind of dynastic model that they have. So with this dynastic model, you are always going to have rules for succession. I think things like progenitor or what is it, ultigenitor, where it's you have the first inherits or the last child inherits. You can have other rules where it's nephews that inherit and these kinds of things. But then you can also have various different electoral systems. You can have systems of tanistry. These are these come from like Ireland and Highland Scotland, for example. And in tanistry, so the clan system works. The clans are usually made up of multiple septs. And I say usually because you can also have some confederated clans, which are, multiple clans joined together. But you can have a clan, and those clans have family groups or like lineages called septs. And for tanistry, the leader of the clan would be chosen from the sept by other potential claimants. So, if the leader for the clan comes from a sept, all of the potential claimants who would be next to be the leader of the clan would then vote amongst themselves for the next leader. And this process of voting was actually very successful. Lasted quite a long period of time in both Ireland and Scotland. And, it was also something that could happen with kings as well. And this was able to create solidarity, and it was also, at the same time able to create lots of rivalries and things as well. So, thinking about a riderly perspective, I mean, there's a lot of conflict that could be generated for a plot from that. Many elective monarchies, though, were much more narrow, where you could only come from a particular line, so a much more exclusive kind of monarchy. And in that case, the nobles are just voting from within a particular line of succession for claimants. And this is quite different from the tanistry, because you can have a situation where titled nobles within a kingdom are electing a claimant from the succession line, rather than tanistry, where you have the claimants voting amongst themselves. And a great example of this is from the Mongols, for example. After Genghis Khan died, then you had everyone gathering together and using, the hoofbeats of their horses to decide who would inherit from his line. Of course, this also tended to involve civil conflicts. But, that is a kind of system. It's a very similar system to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. But elective monarchies are not unique to the European subcontinent or to Central Asia. You also had I believe the Achaemenids used a style of electoral monarchy as well. So this is a pretty widespread practice. And there are a lot of different ways to organize both who is a claimant, so how is that demarcated in society, and then also who gets to vote on electing the monarch. And, of course, you may have a broader pool of people who can be elected at the beginning, and then over time this may narrow. And then you do have situations where, it's very much, especially, I mentioned the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You do have situations where it is like a rubber stamp, or the Holy Roman Empire, for example, where, after a while, the Holy Roman Emperor was specifically a Habsburg. So, you do have the prince electors giving a rubber stamp. But these kind of elective monarchies are also very important when a clear line of succession is not available, and you need the magnates within an empire or a kingdom to get together and essentially have a straw poll to see who would be the one that would be better support. So these do have an important functions when succession is not particularly clear. And, just to go another step further, when we have, kingdoms are not a specific type of polity, like we have all sorts of kingdoms contemporaneously, right? Like the United Kingdom, still a kingdom. Saudi Arabia is a kingdom. And there have been a lot of different kinds of kingdoms historically as well, with different kinds of institutions. Some are more bureaucratic than others, so a lot of different institutions in those. Some of them are more fragmented, more local, more personalists. Some of them derive a lot of their power from ritual, others from military. So, there's a decent amount of room to create a wide variety of kingdoms in a world building project. Kingdoms also seem to be quite teleological. And what I mean here with teleology is that they are inevitable. And this usually comes from a stagist understanding of history. This is where bands become chiefdoms, and chiefdoms become kingdoms, and kingdoms become states. What we do see from early kingdoms is they do tend to emerge from chiefdoms. What you tend to see in chiefdoms, for example, is you've got the just sort of imagining. I mean, from last week, the hierarchical wingless society where you have like a paramount leader who is chosen by the confederated clans, and they elect their sub-leaders, and then each of the clans has their own clan leader. That would be, like a chiefdom. So you could say the paramount leader of the confederated clans is the chief of the clan, and they have sub-chiefs to kind of govern different component parts, and then the clan heads from each of these sub-clans are also involved in this process as well. But that is very much a chiefdom sort of situation. The shift from chiefdom to kingdom happens pretty exclusively because of conquest. So one chiefdom, usually, all of the chiefdom and its surrounding neighbors are peer polities. They all have kind of, similar systems, similar political systems and governing systems. They kind of exist maybe on a continuum, and they are, conflicting amongst each other, but none of them really has an edge. Or, if they do have an edge, then other chiefdoms are allied with each other. So you can't really get ahead in those kinds of systems. But for one reason or another, one of these chiefdoms manages to get an edge. And from that, they are able to consolidate and conquer or diplomatically annex or threaten to subordinate other chiefdoms around them. And then that one chiefdom becomes the paramount chiefdom, and the leader of that chiefdom, then becomes the king. An important part of this as well, especially for kingdoms that tend to last a while, is that they break down previous systems, or they find a way to ingratiate the elites of the other systems to them specifically, because kingdoms are not just a operation of conquest. They're also a consolidating process. They're a centralizing process. A few recent examples. So, say the Zulu, for example. We had this. You had this situation where there were a bunch of polities in the same region, and the it was more of a confederation between the Zulu and another polity, but the Zulu were able to come out on top largely through Shaka's innovations with the military. So famously, these are the shorter thrusting spears with the cowhide shields, ditching sandals so that his warriors could move faster over land, reorganizing strategy, reorganizing kind of the formation on the battlefield, the bull's head formation. So you have the horns on either side for encircling. You've got the head. The head has the veteran warriors in it, and that's the vanguard. And then you have a chest, a reserve, that can later be deployed. He also created a system of warfare where historically in that area, when two groups fought each other, if somebody dropped their spear and they surrendered, that was to be kind of respected, kind of like a chivalry honor code sort of thing. Women and children would also come to watch a battle as it occurred. And, they were not to be harmed by either side. And how the battles played out, usually warriors from that region would use throwing spears, throwing javelins that were longer. And this could result in fewer casualties. So you have these different parts, and I already addressed the change in military technology and the kind of formations that Shaka employed. He also did away with this kind of honor code. He's like, no, we are not sparing anyone who's wounded on the battlefield or who surrenders. We are going to slaughter them and chase down people who we rout and stab them too. The other thing is they wore sandals, and, wearing the sandals meant that they, couldn't move around as quickly. In the reports, Shaka's contemporaries were quite surprised at how quickly his warriors were able to advance and charge on the enemies. And so he was able to conquer, all of the other polities around him. But what he did to centralize is that there was an age set system. So all of the, all of the young men, all the boys who were born in a similar period of time, they would be part of the same age set, and they would be mobilized together in their clan by their clan head for different tasks, like for agriculture and things like that, but also for the military. What Shaka did was he actually got rid of the clan dimension. So instead of just forming solidarity between the young men within a single clan, he said, no, all of the young men within his new kingdom were going to be in the same age set. So then he was creating solidarity between and among all of them. So he was able to kind of break down these these clan networks and the clans as distinct institutions, and he used the age set to sort of incorporate and consolidate and centralize his own power and control. And then what he did was he used the age sets to actually organize his formations. And in that way, he was able to then incorporate them into his military system. Another response to this was in the Hawaiian kingdom. So when the Hawaiian kingdoms were consolidating, you had the paramount chiefs going and conquering the others on the Hawaiian Islands. What you see with that, though, is an actual the abolition of the kind of aristocratic, like the landowning class beneath the king, and through that disempowering them so that they were not able to oppose him. This is a similar thing that I guess happened with Peter the Great in Russia when he was sort of reforming the government and creating, the Russian Empire. Not that it wasn't an empire before. This is probably something we'll come back to. And, so he did away with the Duma, and the Duma was a council that all of the boyars, so the aristocrats, the warrior elites would participate in, the landed kind of warrior elites would participate in. So he did away with the Duma and he replaced it with a small council that he appointed. And, this is how he kind of centralized and created a state where, previously a state-like polity had existed. And in this centralization and, strengthening and creating this, pretty clear state polity, he also kind of centralized the military. And by removing the Duma and by centralizing the army and the military, disempowered the boyars further, so they could still participate in the military, but they would do so as officers in the army. So with the Hawaiian kingdoms and with the Russian Empire, we have sort of an alternate example to the Zulu. Different ways in which to kind of consolidate power. Another example could be the Hunza, and this is one, as opposed to the Hawaiian kingdoms and the Zulu, where there was a lot of conquest. The Hunza are in, I guess it was modern day Pakistan, and they're near the Pamir Mountains, so near the border of China and Afghanistan. The Hunza live above 2,000 meters 2,000 meters in elevation, and they traditionally lived in 3 villages, and I believe this was during the 18th century. Each village had a council of, quote unquote, village elders, but this usually involved the heads of the different families. Then you also had a village head for each of these 3 villages. And then between the villages, they also had a mir. The mir was, their their chief, the chief of the three villages, if we're just going to continue to use that language. So you had the paramount leader of the three villages, who was the Mir. And the what started to change and what kind of transformed this from, a quote unquote chiefdom, if we're using that logic, to a kingdom, is that the Mir started to use the authority available to him to conscript men from each of the villages. So he's like, every household, every family in these villages needs to give me one man for labor. And what he did with that labor is that he actually dug more canals. So, this is high up in the mountains, around the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, that kind of area. And it's a very arid region. So having more of these canals would be, a good idea for their agriculture and things. So he dug several canals that pulled from streams, as well as like rivers, as well as glacial meltwater streams. And this brought more water for irrigation for the villages that already existed. But he also then established new villages along these canals. And so he's creating these new villages and creating more arable land and more irrigation for people, which helps further cement their loyalty to him, thereby centralizing relations to the monarch. And then from that, he then used, this increase in wealth and increase in manpower from having more villages and, having more arable land, which could increase the population, to expand his reach. And, nearby there are Kyrgyz nomads. And historically, these nomads would have been tributaries of other groups, and he was able to bring them in as his own tributaries. And then from that position where he was in the Pamirs, he was also able to raid down into the Silk Road. So where, historically the Mirs of the Hunza would be tributaries to other groups, the Chinese Silk Road traders now were paying him in order to not raid them, kind of the racket situation of extracting rents. And then using that, he was able to conquer nearby polities that were similar, thereby expanding and kind of creating this kingdom, right? So this is a form of conquest, though the conquest is happening in tandem with these major infrastructure projects, with this creation of these new villages, and as well as, extracting tribute and rents from a variety of different groups to improve positions. But what's important here is that from all of these examples, the formation of kingdoms is happening through conquest, through bringing other groups in, and through subsuming them into a kingdom. It should be noted that this is not inevitable. For example, like we look at Mesopotamia, in the upper reaches of the main rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, those tended to have some more like stratified, chiefdoms that lasted for quite some time. Meanwhile, in the lower reaches of those rivers, you had different systems developing. And this is where these city-states like Lagash and and those sorts of systems emerge from. And then at the same time, you also have in the marshlands of the deltas, you had more egalitarian situations carry out there for longer. But so you have this mosaic of different outcomes. So even though these kind of Mesopotamian polities all start from similar situation, they can develop in these different directions. So it's not necessarily inevitable. And likewise, we see something that is called cycling, right? So you, and this is something that certainly happened in Mesopotamia, where you have these first order states, you have these stratified groups that, are able to create these city-states, these provinces where you have a main city and then you have satellite cities around them. And a lot of the economic power in these provinces, in like Sumeria, things like that, are being organized through temples. And the temples have a head. I believe they're called an ensi or esni. Don't quote me on that. No. The esni or the ensi would be, I guess, the equivalent of like a king, though they eventually called them lugals, I believe. I think it's sampa. The sampa are the heads of the temples, and in these city-states, the most important temples, the heir to the ensi would be appointed as the sampa for the most important temple. Yes. So you have these complex systems, and these provinces, these city-states would go to war with one another. They would try to subsume one another, and you'd have these systems where these bureaucratic city-states where, the administrative offices are being drawn from the aristocratic elite, as well as the temple officials and the military elites and those sorts of things. You would have, this concentration, this centralization, these growings of states, and kind of the creation of little empires like Sargon of Akkad and things like that. Well, not that it was little, but it was definitely an early one. And then they would collapse. And, you would have these, and they would collapse because of internal divisions and drives for regional autonomy. Because, as I mentioned, with like the formation of these kingdoms and formation of empires as well, these are centralizing projects. And in these centralizing projects, of course, the lower class people are being exploited as they were in stratified societies. But the magnates are now also being subordinated. So, you can have these internal conflicts where, the center of power then, is having a conflict with their peripheries. The metropole is having a conflict with the peripheries. So you do have cycling where you see stratified societies, hierarchic societies build up and concentrate their power. And then you see political and social change pull them apart. And you see this happen on and off, over the centuries. And this kind of cycling happens in other societies as well. So, you can have a society that's a vertical egalitarian society. And just as a reminder, vertical egalitarianism is where everybody shares the same material situation. And, they're all members of the polity. But some people there are certain lineages that are allowed to achieve status, or there are some lineages that have rank above others. And so these people who can have status, or these groups that have rank, are able to participate in political decisions that the other groups are not. And in more since this is vertical egalitarianism, the lineages that can have status or that have rank are still accountable to those around them, right? The other members of their polity, they are still accountable. Meanwhile, in societies that have more of a stratified system with rank, they are not going to be materially equal, and the stratification turns rank into strata, and these strata have distinct privileges. And so in these vertically egalitarian societies, occasionally you'd have those with rank or those who have status trying to centralize, not necessarily trying, but at some attempt they do try to centralize and to stratify and establish a hierarchy where one did not exist. And many times these attempts are unsuccessful, or they may just be successful for a generation. It's very difficult to kind of pass this thing on to another generation, or maybe it works for two generations, but then people, give it up. If one person, who has status, who has rank, is really great, and they make them, a chieftain, or and then that person tries to pass it on to their son, for example, and their son could be shitty and no one could like them. So it just doesn't work. But occasionally a faction could get together and make it stick. So that is, part of this kind of hierarchical cycling, is that you can have status or rank societies stratify, become more hierarchical, but then, this centralization and this concentration of power devolves. So this concentration and this conquering of one polity of other polities and incorporating them or subordinating them is, how the first order of kingdom is created. But if we're thinking about the middle millennium, and, a lot of fantasy world builders are looking at the medieval European subcontinent, those situations are where these kingdoms and similar polities emerged as successor or rump states from the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, like the Carolingians, and they're not directly from it, but so you have, and how these sort of dissolutions happen, and this has also happened in China, for example, after the collapse of those imperial dynasties too, where the center, so Rome, that changed for the Western Roman Empire occasionally, but just say for Rome for now, Rome would appoint provincial governors. And usually these provincial governors would be cycled. Somebody who is a provincial governor wouldn't have their kid inherit being governor, but their kid could be appointed somewhere else to be the governor of a different province. And this is something that happened with the Carolingians, where they were they were appointing provincial governors. Over time, the governors in those positions started to solidify and calcify where they were inherited, and they got to build a base of support. You also had kings emerging after, during the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire from military leaders in the Western Roman Empire, kind of establishing their own territories. So in these cases, you don't have this kind of first order development of kingdoms by these polities engaging in these conquests. You instead have institutions starting to calcify and become something else, which also contributed to the dissolution, or the fall of the Roman Empire, if we want to call it that. And you have, different parts of the empire sort of peeling off and becoming rump or successor states. You also, had invading groups or groups that had joined the empire and become part of the empire. Oftentimes the different Gothic, Germanic groups that were coming in are presented as, barbarian invaders or whatnot. But oftentimes Rome had invited them in and incorporated them into their military and into their political offices and those kinds of things. And then these groups turned around and, seized state power for themselves, breaking them off into these kingdoms. So kingdoms can also form from the dissolution of larger polities, of these larger empires and things like that. And not all of these were able to maintain the kind of centralization and territorialization of states. So, many of them, some of them were able to cling to statehood for a while. Some of them, were more state-like than others. Occasionally, some of these rump or successor states were able to, rebuild stateness, but they still stayed, pretty stratified, hierarchic, centralized, and whatnot. We also have examples where monarchs, kings, could kind of emerge as political leaders from Republican states, city states, those sorts of things. Rome is a good example of this, where you have these imperial dynasties established out of a republic, which, in its mythic history rebelled against kings. So kingship can emerge in a variety of ways. And you also have what's another one? Yeah, the emergence of Napoleon, for example, and eventually giving way, with that dynasty to Napoleon III, which is the worst Napoleon. If we're going by, one, how interesting they were, but also how successful they were. And, kind of highlighting this, seeing different ways that kingdoms form and seeing how, different time periods and out of different political circumstances, kingdoms emerge in different ways. And depending on how the kingdom emerges, and in that context, that political context, they're going to have different institutions that they govern with through different organizations. They're going to have different structures they have to leverage and engage with. There's really a wide variety of possibilities that can be, sort of lifted up. Kingdoms are often, and what I mean by synchronic, when I said earlier, where kingdoms are presented as synchronic, is that they're presented as belonging to a particular time and place. And as kingdoms being a default polity, particularly in fantasy and associated world building, you tend to see just one kind of kingdom. And it's a kingdom that is, in medieval studies, we use the term medievalism. And medievalism refers to the discourses and narratives we establish about the medieval period. So it's how we understand the medieval period, how we understand the medieval period, not how the medieval period understands itself. And medievalisms are as old as, when the early modern period began, the so-called Renaissance, and you had Renaissance authors and Romantic authors and all these different kinds of thinkers looking back at the medieval period and kind of building an idea of what it was. And medievalism is largely shaped by the media that we look at. So, it can be shaped by historical fiction, for example. I mean, like movies like Kingdom of Heaven and those sorts of things. But it's also inspired by fantasy fiction, which is why I have students who think that the medieval world operated in a similar way to the Game of Thrones, even though the Game of Thrones seems to be more reminiscent to me of the early modern period than the medieval period. So, that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, like the way that people are engaging and thinking about the medieval world is very much influenced by the media that they're engaged with. And what to take away from all this is that when you're thinking about how to create a kingdom, there's a lot of different levers that you can pull at in order to not, make it unique and interesting and whatnot, but to develop it from the world that you're creating, right? Because assumedly if we're thinking about a diachronic way to produce a polity, when you're starting with the base culture, you build out what kind of institutions and religious ideas and those things they kind of have. And this is what I'm going to do with Dove. I'm going to start with the cultures that are migrating to Arukia, kind of set out what their institutions and their beliefs are, how that impacts them as being foragers, hunter-gatherers, whatever term we'd like to use, and then how those things change over time in different places to give us this kind of political diversity. And some of those places will have kingdoms, some of them won't. But what will be interesting about the kingdoms that do develop is that they are coming out of a very particular context. So they're not going to look like, medieval, feudal polities of the, of the European subcontinent. They're going to look different. And as I start to work into those, I'm going to have the footnotes for that that will develop more on kingdoms and present more readings and citations and develop on different ideas from these different kinds of polities. And for Dove, I'm interested in looking at polities where you have power broken up across different segments of society, whether that's in more hierarchic situations, and even in the more hierarchic situations that I'm looking at, like the one for the wingless from last week, you do still have a lot of locus for conflict to emerge in the world building project. And if I ever decide to write something in the setting, that's something else that I'm thinking about, writing stories and fiction and those kinds of things from the setting, kind of a world building first approach. I'm ultimately interested in world building qua world building. I think that world building is interesting in and of itself, though if that's something I ever want to do, building up contexts and situations that can produce conflict is something that I'm interested in, rather than having an idea for a conflict and then kind of just projecting it and building a world around it. And since I mentioned empires a few times, I have seen a lot of kind of conflicting maybe notions of what an empire is, not so much as kingdoms, because I think kingdoms got conflated with things like nation and country and stuff like that, even though sometimes kingdoms have been nation states, they've organized around that. That was a big way that nation states emerged, was through kingdoms becoming empires. So to think about empires, an empire is a kind of, I don't know, I guess like a super polity, if we want to imagine it that way, where a dominant polity is the political center, and there are multiple subordinate polities to it. These, we can call the dominant polity again, like the center of power, the political center. The term metropole is often used. So there's the metropole, which is the dominant center, and then there is the surrounding subordinate polities, and this is the periphery. These almost always emerge from conquest, just like kingdoms. I mean, many kingdoms were in fact empires. Though when we look at what empires do, they tend to be much larger in scale, and they tend to produce very multicultural or cosmopolitan kind of super polities, where the metropole or the center rules many diverse peoples. And something that I've seen, especially from, channels that are like, oh, this is how you world build an empire or something like that, is they very much look at what empires have, essentially the label on the tin. So, and this is something I was talking to Madeline about when she was developing her world building guide, and talking about imperialism, where imperialism are the processes of empire. So it's the things that dominant polities do to subordinate polities. And this can include things like conquest, this can include colonization, this can include establishing predatory economic relationships. But, imperialism includes a very broad set of practices. In some traditions, imperialism is specifically associated with economics. This started with Hobson, who was a liberal thinker, but taken up by Lenin. And, Lenin really liked Hobson, and he said that anyway, besides the point. It's not just economic. It is broadly political. And I mean, the term empire and imperialism was originally applied to empires like the British Empire, but also large land empires as well. But if we look back at history, so for example, things like, the Roman Republic was an empire prior to the Roman Empire. We can think about the Roman Republic in its relationship with the Soci, which were the subordinate polities that Rome organized around itself through conquest, annexation, and through diplomatic annexation. The Soci were subordinate polities to Rome. Rome decided on foreign policy and military action and those sorts of things. And the Soci came along. I mean, the Soci were very important in Rome's military endeavors and campaigns as it grew. I mean, half of Rome's armies were made up of the Soci. And over time, more and more Soci were incorporated within Rome's structures. So you have periods of time where, Rome is, as Rome is growing, it is also expanding membership into the Roman polity, while at the same time it is also incorporating more peripheries as it's growing. But yeah, the Roman Republic was also an empire prior to the name change. This is kind of the joke with North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic, right? Do we believe the name on the tin? We should look back and be critical of past states and what they call themselves and how we analyze them as well. So, the first French Republic and the Kingdom of France that preceded it, the French Empire, they were also engaging in imperialism. They were also empires in practice. Likewise with the Russian Empire. I mentioned Peter the Great earlier. When he changed the transformation from the Russian Tsardom to the Russian Empire was a change in governing structures. It was a change in the political structures of the polity. But like the Russian Tsardom was still an empire. They were engaging in colonization and annexation and rapid expansion, particularly to the east, throughout, Siberia and Central Asia, right? North and Central Asia. And in all these situations where we have this transformation from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, when you have the transformation from, the first French Republic to the French Empire, and from the Tsardom to the empire, these are all transformations in state governance. And as I mentioned before, with kingdoms, this is a concentrating and centralizing exercise where there is a strengthening of territorial control. There is a concentration in extracting more resources from the populace, extracting more manpower, extracting more taxes. One of the ways to do this is to sideline the landed gentry, so the aristocracy, or if you have a world building project where temples are really important and temples control land. We're talking about Sumeria earlier, and where temples are kind of these economic engines. Bringing the temples under the state is another thing that could happen. These prior polities were still doing imperialism. There was a metropole, this kind of paramount domineering polity that functioned as the center of power over subordinate polities that were being conquered. So bringing this back around to the conversation of kingdoms that we kind of started with, there isn't this kind of clear distinction between a kingdom, which again is a polity that is ruled by a monarch, even though there are many different words for them throughout history and contemporaneously, and empires. Many kingdoms were empires, but many empires were also not kingdoms. And since, many empires were kingdoms, and there were a lot of kingdoms that were non-state polities, could be very state-like, empires don't necessarily have to be states either. But what we do see with the formation of empires, with the centralization and the territorialization, the concentration of power, bringing coercion into the state, is that these expansions, these conquests, and for successful early young kingdoms and young empires, the successful consolidation and breakdown of other structures really facilitates the development of states. So we can see states emerging from the political practices of centralizing governance after these conquests, where those that fail after these conquests, those that collapse, don't sufficiently engage in these kinds of practices to be able to impose or supplant or solidify the polity that they've created. And that's something that I do want to reflect in the polity charts that I was working on and sharing last week, and something that I'm hoping to talk about during the World Building Festival. And again, the presentation for the World Building Festival is going to talk about polities and explore the wingless and the different variations of a wingless polity in the Eastern Peninsula, in that AW area with all the deltas and rivers and things, is going to be a more cited video, much like the chariot one that I gave last year. And it is really going to build on the kind of logics and the way that you can think through political change over time. And what I'm hoping to do with Dove is create these different cultures and the different polities where those are the characters, and we can watch them develop and change over time. And I think with that, we are going to end it for this week, about just over an hour. Thank you for coming with me and journeying through lands unknown. I hope you enjoyed the Marginalia videos. Again, this is very minimally edited, wanted to still give it that live feel, and it's also something I could do rather quickly before kind of locking down and getting into marking mode with final assignments and exams and those kinds of things. So if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. You can also sign up for free on Patreon or Ko-fi, and through those you can get a variety of updates for the different lives that are coming up and other things that I'm doing. You can also sign up for a paid membership tier on Ko-fi or Patreon and support the social sciences, including social sciences, in the world building and the projects that I'm working on here. At the first tier, you get updates for what's coming out in the next chapters, as well as what I'm looking forward to in the schedule for the foreseeable future. At the higher tiers, you can vote on one of the videos that comes out every year. And at the highest, you can see videos come out, usually about a week in advance. So thank you everyone again for coming with me into Lands Unknown, and I will see you for our regularly scheduled live, where we are going to start to finish out doing the climate mapping of Zalea next week, April 19th, and I hope to see everyone